Well,
Well, we're
uh,
back together again. David Rosenberg, thank you for sitting down again, this time to talk about photographs from your research. And you have picked 5 different photos for us to talk about. And I know you've given us broad categories for each, but I want you to really drive this conversation and get us started in the order that you have indicated. And I want to say one more thing about the value of historical photographs. Photographs are documents, and you may say more about this while you're talking. In our last conversation, we talked a lot about the power of archives, but also the limitations of archives. And I think that photographs have, some similar themes may emerge. So I'm ready to hear what you have to say. So why don't we get started with the first one?
all right. Thank you, Lauren, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to the expanding audience of the Holocaust Center of Pittsburgh.
Thank you.
Well, I've picked 5 photos, and I'm going to present them in chronological order, essentially, so that we're kind of move through the history of the period just before the occupation of Amiens by the Germans in June of 1940, and we conclude in 1944 with the roundup of French Jews in February of that year. I should say something about Amiens for those of you who are not as familiar with it as I am. It's a city that had about 95,000 people before World War II. Is located about 75 miles north of Paris, directly north of Paris, and therefore on the invasion routes for all comers, essentially. And the Germans swept in and conquered it in May of 1940. Okay, so the first photo I picked, this photo is from the period before that. It's actually it's the one photo that we have an exact date for. And it's November 3rd, 1935. And what it shows is the inside of the synagogue of Amiens, the day the synagogue was inaugurated or dedicated. And this is an interesting photo in a lot of ways to me. For one thing, when I first got into this project, I was part of a informal research group that was trying to put together some idea of like who are the Jews of the Somme region. And other people had done a fair amount of research on this particular question. And I was invited by some people I ran into, including a municipal councilor of the city, to sit in and contribute to this informal research group. And as things developed, I found out people were basically creating a list of all the Jews they thought they had come across in one context or another, and trying to figure out, their essential interest was in who was in deportation. They were individuals who had maybe studied resistance and other people who were deported, and now wanted to find out who the Jewish deportees were. So we went through a lot of different names, and as we went through them, I thought, well, you have these people all separated from each other. It's like a list of individuals, but how do they come together? Didn't they have some kind of relationship to each other? I mean, even what were clearly husbands and wives were not sometimes designated as such. They didn't want to presume anything and sort of laid it out as if it was a bunch of atomized people. So I, got a little, coming from my own perspective, where Jews are in community, let's say. I started talking about the Jewish community, and they said, "Well, what community? So when I came across this synagogue photo in a couple different contexts, it was the inside of the synagogue, and then some more information. Toward the end of that first year, when I started working with this group, I said, "Well, look, there was a synagogue, and it was in the middle of town. I already knew that there was the synagogue I knew about, and the one that they knew about too, was more on the periphery down by the River Somme. Nobody seemed to know from a synagogue, including the president of the Jewish community who there at the time, Dr. Zarka, who became an ally of mine. So what synagogue? So this photo was actually a key to the fact that there was a synagogue, and it was not on the periphery, it was right in the center of town. So anyway, an adventure went off from there, but I won't necessarily detain you. We tried to figure out where the synagogue was, and we knew this guy from North African Jew named Sidney Tabul, and he remembered the time of the synagogue in the center of town. And we went off on an adventure to say, where's the synagogue? And he showed us where it was. And then he said that he thought that the front of the synagogue had been put into storage, that they took the facade down. That whole area had been redeveloped, but they took the facade down and put it somewhere else. And I don't know, I won't pursue this because I won't ever get out of this particular adventure. But for a while, we thought that the facade of the synagogue was in an alleyway right next to the gigantic cathedral, that had been re-erected there. And it was the facade of what was now a restaurant. So we thought, oh my God, at least I did. I thought, oh my God, well, is this what happened to the sort of the memory of the Jewish, cultural edifice? But it turned out that wasn't the particular facade. But anyway, blah, blah, blah. The synagogue was there. And so around that notion, the idea that this was a community, entered into a definite situation. And I thought to myself, well, if there was a synagogue there, why don't we try and get a plaque for the synagogue? So eventually we did. Okay, so that's about the synagogue. Well, let's get back to 1935, November 3rd. A couple of interesting things about this photograph. It looks like it was filmed, and I think I'm doing this particular exercise here. I was reminded that I should probably contact somebody at the newspaper there to see if they have in their film archive somewhere, a copy of the whole program as it unrolled, although it was described pretty explicitly in newspaper reporting. But that's so one interesting thing about it is that videoing of it that still remains to be found. Another thing is, if you look at the photo, there's a gentleman with a fedora who later became a tremendous hero of the French resistance. At the time, he was the Secretary General of the Prefecture of the Somme, the Department of the Somme, named Jean Moulin, Moulin. He was the Secretary General. And he's in that photo with his hat on. And when we created the plaque to dedicate his name is known far and wide. There's even a museum in to him in near Paris. He was tortured by the Gestapo later on and became a martyr of significance for the resistance. But when we put the plaque up, there was a mention that synagogue had been inaugurated in the presence of Jean Moulin. I mean, even though at the time he was not yet the resistance hero, just the very cachet of his name seemed to recommend it as something that would kind of bring the Jewish community world into the French mainstream in some helpful way that would interest more people. So if we look at this synagogue as it was dedicated in 1935, a few years earlier they had been meeting in other private houses, But in this case, they took an apartment building that was donated and they remodeled it on the ground floor to create a assembly space and a ritual space. And the reason that this is only 5 years before the occupation. I mean, the community came together late, and none of the main founders of the community were actually born in Amiens. And not all of them, or very few of them, were born in France. A lot of them were immigrants. And the head of the synagogue, the head of this, the gentleman behind, who was the impetus behind this, was a fellow by the name of Leon Luria, Louria. And Leon Luria was a successful manufacturer of primarily women's clothing, but also made shirts for men and boys in the factory. And he had a number of employees and was, according to his wife, in a letter later on, noted for being a benevolent patron. Good person to work for.
And was he also an immigrant?
Yes, he was. He came from Turkey, from the Ottoman, what was the Ottoman Empire, not yet Turkey, but was actually the area of what is Turkey. Near Bruce, it was called, and there was a thriving, there were thriving Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire, and the Luria family and the Aranias family both came to Amiens, and they were both from that same area around Bruce. Luria had come to Amiens in 1900. He married a local French woman, and it didn't work out well.
So you find the photograph. The photograph is proof of this in-town synagogue.
Yeah.
Was there also an outskirts of town synagogue for the people who had been in Amiens? Like, did the immigrants worship separately from the Jews who had already been there?
No, there wasn't really a great critical mass of people big enough, and so that there wasn't any distinction between Sephardic and Ashkenazic. I mean, I'm not exactly sure what rite they adopted, but there just wasn't enough for that kind of differentiation, which did exist in Paris. You had Paris, you had all kinds of congregations, but Amiens was lucky to make do with one, and actually had to solicit funds from outside the community to even do this remodeling of this apartment building. So that was the situation there. They had a philanthropic committee, like a social action committee. Well, really to reach out to poor Jews, and that was established at the same time the synagogue was. There's a newspaper for Jewish France called L'Univers Israélite, the Jewish world, you might say, Jewish, and they reported on the founding of the synagogue, and then one of the synagogue secretary, Mr. Stahl, then submitted whenever periodic reports about what was going on there. So we actually know a fair amount about the life of the synagogue community before the occupation. Bar mitzvahs that were held there, events that sort of combine French cultural events with Jewish things, like they did a performance of Molière's little part of a play by Molière. They even, I was in retrospect kind of curious to note they had a performance of some airs from Tannhäuser by Richard Wagner, in which the cantor was accompanied by on the piano by a young woman from the congregation, a girl from the congregation. And one of the things that's interesting is they had patriotic events there. A number of the founders were veterans of World War I from French service. Um, so that was that, and I guess the other thing that I want to say about Mr. Luria, who was really the driving force behind this. You know, I don't want to overly stress his contretemps with his wife, who's colorful, but otherwise. But he then remarried. They divorced, and he remarried a woman from Bruce, from his hometown, and Margaret Luria, and she's in our and one of the people in our fiches too. She wrote a letter of which we have too, so that worked out much better. They were a good yoked couple, and both worked out well. They had two children. Isaac and Renee, and Renee later got deported, but was one of the sole survivors. She was the person who came back in 1945 after living through the horrors of the camps, and gave an interview to the Courrier Picard, the local newspaper, in which she explained everything that happened. So, but the Lurias were unapologetic about their Judaism. When Margaret Luria wrote her letter, she said, "I'm an Israelite and Jew like my husband." Whereas others were kind of saying, "I never was." Others were not so bold, but he was bold, and his boldness led to his being the driving force behind the community. So that. In the plaque in the synagogue, his name is featured as the founder and president, just after World War II.
And was he also a victim in the Holocaust?
Yes.
Only the daughter survived of the family?
Yes.
So
No. Only Leon Luria died. Yeah. No. The son was not in Amiens when the roundup occurred. I'm not exactly sure, but he came back afterward, after the war, and took up the mantle of his father for a while, still waiting for him to return from, describing himself as delegated by the president, who's, until his return. But he didn't. He was back in town before his sister came back. And then a month before the sister came back, which was in May of 1945, the mother died of stress, some health condition, but aggravated by having gone into hiding. Her son later tried to claim some survivor benefit from her based on the fact that she was persecuted, and they turned him down, saying they couldn't find any record that she was pursued. Anyway, all right. Well, that kind of gets us somewhat through the synagogue.
Yeah. So let me just
questions.
Yeah. Let me just kind of tie this up before we move on. And I mean, what I'm thinking about as we talk about this is a couple of things that you said. And so the framework for my thought is that we talk about 6 million, right? And then we say, no, we need to know about individuals. And what you're saying is that you said these individuals are connected as a community, and discovering the history of the synagogue reestablishes that community. The other thing we say is entire communities were destroyed as a real generalization, but your work restores the functioning of that community, events in that community, the people who built it and funded it and created benevolent aid societies and did all of these things. So, right. I mean, it speaks to the power of this kind of research, that it recreates a lost history and gets down to the level of the individual and the family dynamics and everything else. And that is so powerful. So I wanted to say that because just hearing you talk about it, I can picture it. I can picture this lost community.
Thank you. I can too. Yes. I got a very, very nice email, which I'll share with you guys from a French academic. It describes the kind of the way our website. I sent her the latest page from our website, which has photos and the letters of the Jews together, and she really kind of got to the heart of the matter, I think, in someone just describing the project. I mean, just the general spirit and intent, let's say, of the research, And I said, to me, it's powered by love and indignation. So
yes,
that's my terse summary.